Hello once again. Today we're studying together the first 11 verses of chapter 11 in Mark's account of Jesus' life. The book we know as his Gospel or Good News, and it's a remarkable story. Mark tells us that as they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord needs it, and we'll send it back here shortly.'" They went and found a colt outside in the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now, it's quite likely that the event recorded here on what Christians have ever since called Palm Sunday occurred in the evening of the same day in which Jesus had set out from Jericho. What took place is often described as the triumphal entry, as Jesus entered Jerusalem and is acclaimed as a king. As we will see in the coming studies, this marks a fresh development in Jesus' ministry, one in which he resorts to what we might call symbolic actions or acted parables, so as to seek to drive home the truth of who he is to the crowds and also, of course, to us. The crowd who greeted Jesus quoted from a song that was often used as pilgrims arrived at Jerusalem for the celebration of the annual Passover feast. We shall learn more about this in the coming studies. So Psalm 119 verses 25 to 26 was used by the priests to welcome pilgrims to the temple. The crowd, however, picked up the passage and gave it a messianic twist, identifying Jesus as the greatest of all pilgrims, the Messiah that they had long expected. So they too arrive at the same conclusion that Bartimaeus did earlier in the day. Here is the promised Son of David. Indeed, their actions support this. Many years before, as recorded in the book known as 2 Kings, in chapters 9 verses 12 and 13, the coronation of a king named Jehu was accompanied by spreading garments before him. So the crowd clearly believe that they are welcoming the promised Messiah king. Indeed, Jesus' own action of riding on an ass contains his own claim to kingship. Those of highest rank in the ancient world often travelled sat on asses or mules. Interestingly, however, Mark does not make the obvious connection with Zechariah chapter 9 verse 9, as both Matthew and John do in their accounts of the event. It's as though Mark recognises that there is a dimension about the event that was partially hidden, and which, as we shall see, the crowd missed. 2 things are therefore striking. The passage in Zechariah speaks of a gentle, not a warlike Messiah. Warrior kings rode on horses, not asses, in the ancient world, and Jesus leads the crowd to the temple, not to the nearby Antonia fortress. It was the temple that received his imperious look, not the fortress. His is a different sort of kingdom. It is a spiritual kingdom. Simply then, this passage is intended to remind us that Jesus came not to overthrow human oppression, but the greater oppression under which humankind suffers, the oppression of sin. He came not to establish an earthly kingdom, but the kingdom of God in which men and women are reconciled to God. Humbly and meekly, as we will see, he set his face toward the cross, for there the great victory that humankind needed was to be achieved. Christians, as we've already said, often refer to this passage as the triumphal entry, but it's actually a tragedy, not a triumph. The crowd in their early enthusiasm salute their king, but by the time Jesus had reached the temple, only the disciples remain. Later in the week, the same crowd will cry, "Crucify him," perhaps the result of feeling that they were taken for fools earlier in the week. They had correctly made the initial connections, but the tragedy was that they had read the concept of messiahship through their own preconceived ideas and ended up never perceiving the truth. And not only did they not benefit from the truth, they tragically turned against it. People who are not Christians are often willing to give Jesus a high status as a prophet or an inspirer of men, and perhaps that's true of you. And this passage, however, provides therefore a challenge. Is your interest in Jesus one that sees him as some sort of prophet or semi-divine figure? Or are you willing to consider that he may be the deliverer of humankind? God come down from heaven to deliver humanity from its bondage to sin. But what about those of us who are Christians? All too often the same tragedy is played out in our own lives and churches. The gospel we preach is all too rarely one of salvation from sin, and all too frequently one which is more concerned with demonstrations of power and the satisfaction of personal needs now. Not infrequently, failure leads to Jesus being reviled or abandoned. The way we live before one another all too frequently is marked not by humble service, but seeking personal power and authority, just as the disciples in the earlier passage of this chapter. We've accommodated to the worldview of the Antonia fortress rather than the temple of God. So is this a triumphal or a tragic entry? It depends on one's point of view. It depends on what we're looking for, and paradoxically it depends on whether we perceive what God is looking for in us. Who is Jesus? What is the nature of his kingdom? How should I live in the light of this passage? These are all important questions, each one of them. And what is my answer and yours? And how will we live it out? But there's one final point to make here. Earlier in his ministry, Jesus was anxious to avoid people being drawn to conclusions about who he was. He obviously wanted them to make a considered decision based on all that he intended to reveal to them through his actions and his teaching. However, all that changes here. Jesus takes the initiative to challenge the crowds to recognize him as the promised King Messiah. And when they claim him to be king, he makes no attempt to silence them. It's as if he's saying, you ought by now to be in a position to know who I really am. And perhaps he's saying the same to you and me. Mark has said he believes that Jesus is God incarnate, God in a human body. He's recorded some of Jesus' extraordinary, out-of-this-world miracles, and he's also reported some of Jesus' teaching that stunned the crowds, as it was unlike anything else they had ever heard. So it's as if Mark, guided by Jesus' own actions, who is speaking to us here and says, isn't it time you make up your mind about Jesus?